Blood feeding is disgusting when people do it, but when animals do it, it's kind of charming. And I've been kind of obsessed with blood feeding animals because I just worked on a review paper with Jerry Carter for the Canadian Journal of Zoology about how vampire bats, which feed on blood, how they evolved that ability, where they came from in an evolutionary sense. And we compared them to all the other different kinds of animals that feed on blood, things like leeches and ticks and stuff like that. And so my brain is full of blood feeding facts. And so I wanted to share 5 things you definitely need to know about blood feeding. The first thing you need to know is that vampire bats are the only mammals that feed on blood. They're very special that way, and they're unique among mammals for a whole bunch of different reasons, but it all starts with the fact that they've functionally become parasites. Now, I have a special place in my heart for vampire bats because I studied them for my PhD. I'm the guy that put vampire bats on a treadmill and saw how they could run. I did that with my collaborator, John Hermanson. He was my PhD advisor. But also there, while I did those projects, was a young undergrad named Jerry Carter. And Jerry has gone on to become a tenured professor at The Ohio State University, where he studies vampire bats to this day. And he is my co-author on this review paper. And so anyway, I just like Jerry a lot. So you don't need to know that. That's not part of my list. The second thing that you do need to know, though, is that blood feeding, although it's rare among mammals, has evolved in other animals 28 times at least. So yeah, vampire bats have it, but so do at least 7 different kinds of birds. So do leeches. So do lamprey. So do vampire snails, these weird animals that have a long proboscis they can stick into the eye socket of a sleeping fish so they can drink their blood. There's a moth that feeds on blood. There are a whole bunch of different animals that feed on blood. And if you look across the whole animal tree, you find that blood feeding is this thing that keeps evolving over and over and over. At least 16 times among insects. There are so many flies that drink blood. And it makes sense because the whole having a blood system, like closed blood vessels with blood in them, that evolved 400 million years ago. And that's like a jackpot for nutrients. If you're a parasite, that is definitely where you want to go. And so animals keep evolving ways to get at the blood. And so you've got all these different groups that feed on blood. It's kind of crazy. So we made this big list and we found at least 29 different groups, including the vampires, that came up with the ability to feed on blood. The third thing I want you to know is that some of the blood feeders do it in a way that doesn't hurt the host. It doesn't hurt the animal whose blood it is. What they do, it's basically like if instead of robbing a bank yourself, you wait till somebody else robs the bank and then you go beat them up and take the money from them. That's kind of what these animals do. There's a jumping spider called Ivarcha. It looks for mosquitoes that are full of blood because they stole it from a person, and then they hunt those mosquitoes. They never hurt the people. They never go near the people, but they go after the mosquitoes. That's kind of cool. And they use that blood to make pheromones. So they really do need the blood, but they just don't go get it directly from people. They just go get it from mosquitoes. There's also a biting midge that treats mosquitoes like it's a mosquito of mosquitoes. So it feeds on a mosquito to get the blood out of it, and it doesn't take the blood directly from the person. I just think that's really cool. The fourth thing I want you to know about blood feeding is that water becomes a big problem for blood feeders because most of blood is water. It's a very watered down food resource. And so like a vampire bat, for example, it starts feeding. The first thing it has to do is dump the excess water. Its whole body turns into a giant filter. Its kidneys are working like crazy to get rid of water so it can keep whatever proteins and amino acids it's getting. So when a vampire bat feeds, it just pees. It just pees and pees and pees. And it'll sit there for like 20 to 40 minutes just peeing everywhere, trying to just make a more concentrated version of the blood so that when it flies away, it's going to have enough amino acids to actually make a meal of this thing. If it just took all the blood, it would have way too much water. It would be too bloated. So even though when a vampire bat's finished feeding, it weighs 50% more than it did when it started. So that's like me having a 100-pound meal. The vampire bats are still stuck with this really watered down food resource. But then the cool thing is that once they land and they start digesting it, they're digesting amino acids, they're digesting proteins, and so what that requires is a ton of water. Their kidneys really have to work hard, but they've gotten rid of all the water, and so they find themselves in this position where they're like, oh, I wish I'd kept that water, but they didn't because it would be too heavy to fly with all that water, and they would be too distended. So it's this crazy thing for vampire bats where they have way too much water when they start feeding and not enough water when they're digesting it. It's not an easy meal source to have. It's no wonder it's hard for mammals to drink blood. But the last thing I want you to know, the fifth thing on my list, is that we shouldn't be so smug about blood feeders. It feels like a really gross thing to go and drink the blood of another organism so that you can get food out of it. But I know a tree isn't an animal, but when we make maple syrup, we're basically doing exactly the same thing as a vampire bat does. We're drinking the blood. I mean, the tree has this circulatory system that it uses to move sugars around in its body. And we're tapping into that, and we're taking it, and then we're concentrating it, and then we're using those sugars for us. We're doing exactly the same thing. We're basically vampires of maple trees. So don't be so smug. Vampire bats may seem a little weird, but we have more in common with them than you give them credit for. That's all. Thanks a lot.